Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Bias Awareness for the Asian Community, facilitated by the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General, Division of Criminal Justice, and the U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Service. Before we get started, I'd like to run over a few housekeeping items so you all know how to participate in today's event. First, all lines here are on mute. If you have a question, you will have the opportunity to text them into today's presenters. Please type your thoughts into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send them in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them throughout the Q&A. Similar questions will be combined, and inappropriate or offensive questions will not be announced. And due to time constraints, please try to keep all questions on topic. If you experience any technical difficulties at any point during our presentation, please explain your problem through the chat feature and we will try our best to address the issue. Now, I'd like to introduce Matthew Latimer from the U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Services.
Good morning and welcome to our program. We're going to begin with a welcome from the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, Craig Carpenito.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you for having me here today and for the opportunity to just say a couple words. It's obviously been a whirlwind 12 hours for me for those who, with access to news, but it was still incredibly important for me that I get here and that I'm able to speak. I've been blessed to work with some of the folks on this call on a few of these events, including Harpreet and Matthew. Hate crime in this country is something that I've been saying for years. I never imagined would be part of my docket as U.S. Attorney. I thought we were past all of this in this country. I really did. And I'm incredibly disappointed and disheartened that this is something we're still talking about in 2020. But it's real. We've seen it in New Jersey. We saw it in December with the hate-motivated attacks that occurred in Jersey City and the unfortunate consequences of those actions. We lost 5 innocent people as a result, or 4 innocent people, I guess. And we've seen it in our police ranks. My predecessor, Bill Fitzpatrick, who was a career prosecutor and a phenomenal lawyer, before I became U.S. Attorney, charged the first police officer with a federal hate crime in this country in a decade. That case is United States Frank Nussera, and it's currently pending down in Camden. Although we convicted Nussera of one of the allegations against him relating to lying to the FBI, jury hung on the hate crime element. And we were faced with a decision as to whether or not we wanted to retry that case or just accept the split verdict from the jury. And I can tell you that that decision took me all of about, as long as it took to say the words absolute. Because if there's anything that's important to me right now, it's important that all of us do, that care about society, care about our state, and care about the people we serve, is to identify hate-based crimes, crimes that are related to ideologies or demographics, whatever it may be. Call it what it is. Not just prosecute it, not just bring those people to justice. Important that we do so under the moniker that it deserves, which is we call the person, the perpetrator, someone who is committing a hate crime. And we tell the world that we won't tolerate it and we won't accept some excuse to make it go away. And that's what we're going to do here in New Jersey. That's what we've been doing here in New Jersey. And that's what I'm committed to doing going forward. Because if there's one thing that we can't abide by, first and foremost on that list is mistreatment of people simply because of the color of their skin, the religion that they decide to believe in, their political views, or anything. The First Amendment is the most important of all amendments in my view. It's something that we need to make sure that we work steadfastly to protect and we don't let it deteriorate on our watch. So I'm happy to hear that this seminar is going on today. I'm incredibly proud to have, one of my leadership here, Raul Agarwal, who's my executive assistant U.S. attorney, which is the third highest spot in our office, talk about the efforts we're making. And I just want to tell all of you that in a time where it seems there is a lot of motivation out there in the world to try and cause a further divide in this country, I know that we have a responsibility to make sure that we push back against that and combat that. And that's what we're going to do. So, thank you for your time. And I just encourage everyone on this call to, no matter what your position is, to call it out when you see it, make sure that we know about it, and work with the folks on this call from both the state and the Department of Justice to help us try to put an end to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, U.S. Attorney Carpenito, for those words and for your welcome. We're going to continue our program with a message from the Attorney General of New Jersey, Prabir Grewal.
Hey guys, this is New Jersey Attorney General Prabir Grewal, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't join you in person for this important webinar. But in the midst of a global pandemic and protests worldwide, I'm reminded of one of the passages from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. When he was imprisoned after protesting segregation, he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. So when one individual is dehumanized, when one person is assaulted, when one community is harassed, all of us suffer for it. We're witnessing a rise of hate and intolerance that has become all too familiar. We're seeing it in our cities, in our neighborhoods. We're seeing individuals assaulted simply for who they are, or what they believe, or who they love. It's a moment where principles that we thought were protected and safe are now being challenged. And nothing demonstrates this more than the rise in the number of bias incidents right here in New Jersey. In 2017, we had 549 reported bias incidents. 2018, that number jumped to 569. And in 2019, that number jumped to almost 1,000, to 944. And in 2020 alone, from January to May, we have 433 such incidents. And of these, 26 involve Asian Americans. 14 of them are COVID-19 related, and those numbers are troubling. As a career prosecutor and as someone who wakes up thinking about public safety, goes to bed thinking about public safety, it's simply unacceptable that these actions occur. We have to develop concrete solutions that push back against hate and intolerance, and instead turn toward a more welcoming and a more inclusive state. Each and every one of you attending this webinar is a voice for your community. You're in a unique position to bring communities together, and that includes strengthening the relationship between law enforcement and individuals throughout the state. If we work together, we can reach residents in this state where we otherwise wouldn't reach them, and it can strengthen public trust and public safety for all New Jerseyans. We need to do whatever we can to push back against bigotry and hate, to ensure that as a state, we rise above it. So whatever your background, whatever your belief, all of us can go about living our lives peacefully, living in neighborhoods that are welcoming and inclusive. So thank you for taking the time today to attend this important bias awareness seminar, to stand up against hate and intolerance in New Jersey, and thank you, most of all, for bringing communities together and for fighting hate wherever you may see it. Thank you.
Next, we'd like to bring back on Matt Latimer.
Yes, thank you, Whitney. We're going to continue with an introduction by our Deputy Director of the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice, Rob Scipio.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Scipio. I'm a Deputy Director with the Division of Criminal Justice, and I am proud to be here today on a Saturday to deal with all of the issues that all of this community is facing. You told us when we asked for input from you that you're afraid. You told us that you were isolated. You told us that you were scared. We are all here to tell you that you are not alone. There's going to be one theme, and that theme is going to be expressed by a number of people today, and that is we want you to report any incident, even if it's verbal, to us help you live your lives with the dignity and the respect that you deserve as private citizens here in New Jersey. It's really important for you to report to us any incident that you believe you have been targeted as a victim of a bias incident or crime, and we're going to talk to you about what that means today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system and the structure of it here in New Jersey. You may actually, in your interaction with law enforcement, you may actually deal with a local police officer. You may report to a local police officer an incident where you believe you're a victim of bias, crime, or incident. That police officer reports to a chief in their local municipality. That chief reports to a county prosecutor. The county prosecutor is the chief law enforcement officer of the county in which you live, whether it be Passaic or Essex or Hudson County. There is a prosecutor that is the chief law enforcement officer in that county. Why do I talk about that? Because if you report to your local police department an incident and you don't believe that you're being heard or listened to or it's being investigated, you can talk to the county prosecutor's office. But we're not done, because the county prosecutor reports to the attorney general. The attorney general is the chief law enforcement officer in the state of New Jersey, and the attorney general oversees the 21 county prosecutor's office. And so if you believe that at the county level, your report of a bias incident or crime are not being taken seriously, you can report it to us at the attorney general's office. One thing I want you to understand is there is no daylight between the state, the federal, the county, or the municipalities with regards to incidents of bias crime and bias incidents. We all take this very seriously. I want to talk a little bit about your interaction with the police, and based upon the number of questions that we had, some questions that you may have about your interaction. For example, one person asked, is an officer permitted to place a person in a chokehold or place their knee on the neck of an individual in New Jersey? And the answer to that question, being a trainer for the Police Training Commission, is no, they are not. That has always been our policy in New Jersey. That constitutes deadly force in New Jersey. The second question that many of you asked, can police officers come up and simply ask me for my ID based solely upon my ethnicity and no other reason? And the answer is no, they can't. And as a matter of fact, you have a right to refuse. Another question, will the police check on my immigration status if I report a crime? And based upon a number of policies, the Immigration Trust Directive, a number of other directives here in New Jersey for municipal law enforcement officers in county and state, the answer is no. Will the local police report me to ICE if I have a civil detainer? And the answer to that as well is no. They cannot report, and we cannot detain based upon a civil detainer. Some of you probably sure have a lot of questions about what we have done before the recent events to train officers. I could tell you in New Jersey, we have been on the forefront working with our federal partners to train law enforcement officers. All law enforcement officers in New Jersey since 2017 have had mandatory cultural diversity training, implicit bias training. They've actually had training interacting with the Asian community, and we continue to press out and do a number of programs to ensure that officers understand your perception and, more importantly, serve you, your community. I started this the way in which I'm going to end this, and I'm going to talk to you one more time at the end. Please help us help you live your lives with dignity, with the peace and respect that your family, your community as a whole deserve. And that is, please report. Report any verbal harassment that you have. Report any physical harassment or threats or assaults that occur. We need your help. You have a right as a citizen not to live in fear. We are here for you. We are ready to serve.
Thank you, Deputy Director CPO, for sharing that with us. We're going to continue on in our program and have the AG's guidelines on bias investigation standards with David Leonardis, who is the Training and Outreach Liaison for the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Leonardis. I'm the Training and Community Outreach Liaison with the Division of Criminal Justice, and welcome. One of my functions is to work with and coordinate with the 21 county prosecutors, community outreach liaisons. Every county prosecutor's office has folks that work with the community, work with local police departments to work with the community. And I also coordinate the bias crime liaisons in all 21 county prosecutors' offices as well. I work with our state and federal partners to put on events like today. And in addition to that, in addition to working with our partners to put on community events, we also are involved in law enforcement training. So I get involved with training, CLEAR training. CLEAR stands for Community Law Enforcement Affirmative Relations. That's training that police officers have to take at least 3 credits every year to be able to enhance their abilities to work with the community. So, and actually, with the working group from the Asian community that helped us put on today's events, they are helping us develop a cultural awareness, more in-depth cultural awareness training session for the entire law enforcement community. I think Rob mentioned a little bit about that before, but we're actually expanding and enhancing on that cultural training for the law enforcement community. In addition to that, you know, we train law enforcement officers on things like this: bias incident, bias crimes, the bias incident reporting system. And our partners from the Department of Justice tell us we have one of the most in-depth, comprehensive bias reporting systems in the country. In addition, you know, we also train on things like the Attorney General's guidelines when it comes to bias incident investigation standards. Okay, those standards were just updated in 2019. First time they've been updated since the year 2000. But you know, every police officer, every police department in the state received some training on that, as did the bias crime liaisons. So you will have the opportunity. Those guidelines are online, and what they focus on, just so you know, a quick overview, is that they're a guide for police officers when they are investigating an incident. They're also talk about the role and responsibilities of the supervisor when there's a bias incident being investigated, particularly when it comes to dealing with the victim. And it talks about the police chief's role when it comes to dealing with the community. So they're very comprehensive. I suggest if you get a chance to take a look at them, please do so. Moving forward, if you have any questions, you have any needs, I'm going to be your point of contact. You should have received an email from me yesterday with some attachments. It had all my contact information on it, and you will be receiving more information from me, after this event. So I look forward to working with you and enjoy the rest of today's presentation. Thank you, Matt.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. We're going to move on to reporting bias incidents and investigative procedures with Detective Brian Christensen, who is with the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for everyone for putting on this great presentation and the very important presentation. I see that there's actually over 800 people actually attending this, so this is great that the community can come out and kind of listen to what's going on with all of this. We've created a PowerPoint to kind of guide you through some of the steps in reporting bias incidents. I'm going to go to the next slide. So as the Attorney General was mentioning about the bias incident stats, the bias incident stats that we collect are bias incidents that are reported to police. They're not reported, we don't collect anything that's reported to civic groups, to community groups. It's basically everything that's reported to police. I'm going to echo what Deputy Director CPO was saying about reporting. And I'll be focusing in on that and why it's very important to report to police. But we'll go back 2019, January to May, we had 345 total bias incidents. 2020, January to May, we had 433 total bias incidents. In 2019, the total bias incidents involving the whole entire year involving Asians was 38. So far this year in 2020, the bias incidents involving Asians is 26 reported bias incidents. COVID-19 bias incidents is a concern of the Attorney General as well as rest of law enforcement. So we've been keeping pretty good stats as to incidents involving COVID-19 related bias incidents with Asians. There was 14 reported bias incidents received that were COVID-19 Asian related out of the total of 38 COVID-19 reported bias incidents. Next slide. So this diagram is basically a walkthrough on what happens when you report a bias incident. Basically, the feedback that we got from the community members was they really wanted a guideline as to what happens when they call the police and let them know. Maybe no one's really had any interaction with their local police department. So this guideline will show you through. So a victim reports a bias incident to the local police via 911 or a walk-in complaint. What will happen after that? The local police will follow up with documenting it with a bias incident report and initiate an investigation. That bias incident report has to be sent out within 24 hours of the incident happening. So who receives these bias incidents? And you'll see why bias incidents are basically looked at a little more harder with a lot more scrutiny. It's sent out to both the county prosecutor's office, bias crime unit, and they will receive the bias incident, as well as the Division of Criminal Justice bias crime unit receiving the bias incident. So you'll have two layers of review looking at this bias incident. What will happen is the county will first review it and say if there should be charges of bias intimidation brought upon the suspect in this incident. Division of Criminal Justice will also review it and coordinate with the local and county and provide assistance with the investigation if needed. So let's say what happens if it does happen to be a bias intimidation charge that's going to be done. The county or the state is going to bring it to grand jury, where grand jury will review it and see if the person should be charged with bias intimidation, if it's going to be prosecuted by the county or by the state. Next slide. So this is what a supplementary bias incident offense report looks like for police officers. There's a lot of checklists. If anyone wants to see the actual report themselves so they can see a little clearer, I know it's hard to see right here on the screen, to see all the categories that a police officer has to check off. You could either go to njsp.org or the Division of Criminal Justice bias crime site, where you can take a look at the offense report. But this is what a police officer is supposed to complete. This is now done electronically. It makes the local police officer's job a lot easier when they have to do a bias incident report. Everything that you see here is basically a check down list for the police officer. Once they do that, they'll fill in, if you can see on the bottom there's a little narrative section. They'll put in the narrative section actually what happened with the offense, and that gets sent out. After that gets sent out, like I said, it goes to the local, the county prosecutor's office and to our office, and then to state police as well. So state police uniform crime reporting is involved with keeping all of the statistics for all of this. At the end of the day, if you want to see a breakdown of all the bias incident that have happened in the state of New Jersey, in your county as well, you could go to state police's website, again, njsp.org, and review the uniform crime report from last year to see the bias incidents. Next slide. All right, so what happens when you report to the police, and what do you have to try to tell the police when a bias incident happens? You got to be very specific with what happened. It's important when you're reporting to the police that, you know, if a slur was used, be specific with exactly what was said, in the manner of how it was said to you. It's not good to just tell the police that, oh, they said a slur, and you don't give the full information as exactly what was said. This can be used later on down for prosecution if need be. You want to try to remember to give as much information to the police about the offender's maybe tattoos, race, height, weight, clothes that the suspect was wearing. This will be good for if the police are going to have to try to find the suspect immediately and to capture him or her. If a vehicle is used in the commission of a bias incident, try to obtain the license plate. This also is very good at being able to identify as to who committed this bias incident. If the incident has happened in the past with the same person, make sure the police are aware of all the incidents. This goes back to the importance of reporting, as to what I said before. If all the prior incidents have been reported, the police will have documentation of all the prior incidents. If nothing's ever been reported to the police will have no documentation that this existed. If something has been going on for a while and you tell the police this, you know, the police are only going to have what happened at that one time. Again, this goes towards building a case moving forward, such as harassment. Next slide. All right, I'll follow with the last thing here. We are in a COVID-19 pandemic world where, unfortunately, we have people in this world that are taking advantage of everyone online. Zoom cases, they're called Zoom bombing right now. They've been running rampant throughout the US since the inception of COVID-19. In New Jersey, we've had several instances involving cultural and religious groups targeted by Zoom bombing. These cases are crimes when they happen, especially these bias incidents. These have to be reported to police. Don't let this go and say these are kids doing this. These have to be reported. Social media now is now very big. We have now just did a study. Over 20% of all the bias incidents of this past year have been done through social media, through text messages. And again, you have the pandemic world where people are taking advantage of that. Please, if you see something, say something. I'll borrow that line from Homeland Security. It's important you report that. If you see something online that could be a possible bias threat, report it to your local police. That's why we're here. We're here to help you. as citizens. We're not going to ignore threats. We're not going to ignore anything. We look into all this stuff, and as I said before, you know, when you report a bias incident, these are reported through several chains of command through county and state, so we do take this seriously. I appreciate this, and I'll be around to answer questions at the end of this presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate that. We'll continue. Our next presenter is David D'Amico, who's the president of New Jersey Bias Crimes Officers Association, and he will be talking about bias incidents versus bias crimes.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you. I am a 31-year veteran and currently the chief investigator of the Middlesex County Department of Corrections and Youth Services. And as stated, I'm also the president of the New Jersey Bias Crime Officer Association. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, all of our community stakeholders and law enforcement partners, for being here today to discuss what we believe is a very important topic and timely as well. The New Jersey Bias Crime Officer Association is made up of law enforcement professionals from every level of federal, state, county, and local law enforcement. Our mission is to ensure and promote a positive working relationship between law enforcement and the community, and our bias crimes liaisons are trained to identify bias-motivated incidents, investigate and prosecute the crime of bias intimidation, and be a direct point of contact to you, the public, at any time for anything. I'd like to start by acknowledging that what we're all aware of. Bias is not predisposed. No one is born with the gene of hate. So how does bias start? Next slide, please. What we have here illustrated is the pyramid of prejudice. Bias, prejudice, stereotypes are learned behavior. So reaching out to our children and young adults, our heroes, leaders, and role models in our community is so imperative and important. I'd like to start by building this pyramid from the foundation, so everybody can understand how bias starts, how it happens, and the most likely cause of the majority of motivated bias incidents and bias crimes, not only in New Jersey, but across the country. Next. The foundation of bias, prejudice, and stereotypes is ignorance. It is learned behavior. Nobody's born with a gene of hate, and our young adults, especially our young adults, are taught this ignorance by people that they know and trust. Next slide. If we allow the ignorance that we've been taught to grow, then it moves quickly up the pyramid of prejudice, next, to the act of indirect prejudice. This is very indirect. It is not motivated or pointed or poignant towards one person or one thing. It's where somebody takes the ignorance that they've been taught and they spread it amongst people that they know and trust. Next. Next. If we do nothing about that level of predisposed ignorance, then the next stage becomes the avoidance stage. This happens very early on in life, usually happens in school. If you can remember back to maybe elementary school or middle school, I don't want that kid sitting at my lunch table. He's one of them. She's one of them. I don't want to pick that kid to be on my gym team. He's one of them. She's one of them. Those are just some examples of how the ignorance that our young adults are taught, then they're predisposed to start to avoid if we don't stop it at that level. Next. The next level on the pyramid is the exclusion stage. This was never more prevalent in our society than after post-September 11th, the terrorist act of September 11th, when common average everyday citizens started to exclude people from their lives based on their perceived ignorance of who the person may be. What you're looking at right now is a pyramid, but it's also shaped like a volcano. If we, the community, doesn't do anything about the bottom, then it's going to cross what we call in law enforcement the point of no return. What you're looking at is illustrated as a bias incident. If it goes to the next stage, next, it becomes a bias crime. Every single bias crime in New Jersey and across the country started at the bottom of the pyramid: ignorance, learned behavior, prejudice, bias, and stereotypes. Now, if we do nothing about bias crimes, it moves to the pinnacle to peak the top. Next. And that is extermination. And what you're looking at here is not only the pyramid of prejudice, it's not only how bias rears its ugly head and is allowed to happen unless we do something about it, but it is also a blueprint of history. What you're looking at is the blueprint of both Adolf Hitler and the blueprint of Osama bin Laden. Next. Fear is ignorance. If we do nothing about ignorance, it'll turn to prejudice. If we do nothing about prejudice, it'll turn to hate. And if we do nothing about hate, it'll turn to violence. Next slide. What we're looking at now, not only in New Jersey, but across the country, is the potential for a hate crime to have a nexus to terrorism. The definition of terrorism is the use of force and threat of force to intimidate. Its primary effect is to instill a sense of fear, not only in the victim, but the victim's larger community. That's why it's so important. As the theme of our program today is "You are not alone." It is also, if you see something, to please say something. It is so important that if you are the victim of any type of bias, whether it's a bias incident at the bottom of the pyramid, or if it unfortunately rises to the level of the crime of bias intimidation or a hate crime in New Jersey, then we ask you to please step up and say something, because what we're looking at is the potential for even a bias incident to move up that pyramid and become a nexus to an act of terrorism. Bias crimes and hate crimes are message crimes. The perpetrator is sending a message not only to the actual victim, but to the victim's larger community. Next. When we investigate in law enforcement bias crimes, and what we ask the community to do as we implement community outreaches across our state, is we call them the 3 R's. Next. Next. The first R is recognize. Recognize the difference between a bias incident and bias crime, and recognize when an incident of bias is happening. Once you recognize it, we ask you to please respond to it, to please do something. If you see something, say something. And what we're asking you to do is contact your local law enforcement and report that incident. By the way, that's the same 3 R's that law enforcement is trained in, that the Deputy Director Sepio talked about in the law enforcement training that every single police officer in the state of New Jersey attends at the pre-academy or police academy level and post-academy in service training. Next. So let's recognize together. Next. What is the difference between a bias incident and a bias crime? Well, a bias incident is the bottom level in the pyramid. It's an attempt or a completed action that is motivated by bigotry or bias regarding a person's real or perceived. And there's 9 categories in New Jersey, 9 protected classes: race, color, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, national origin, and ethnicity. An example of a bias incident, as illustrated in the pyramid of prejudice, is name calling, offensive language, inappropriate gestures and behavior. And when that is motivated by bigotry or bias regarding any one of the 9 protected classes that you see in front of you, the law enforcement across the country, and especially New Jersey, has noted that to be a bias incident. Again, please, whether it's a bias incident or a bias crime, if you are affected by any type of bias, we ask that you please say something. Please contact your local law enforcement department, and there is a step and process that goes into effect once you make contact with police. Next. In New Jersey, our bias crime statute is not called a hate crime, but it really is almost the same thing. In New Jersey, our bias crime statute is 2C-16-1, the crime of bias intimidation. And what that statute says is now we're moving up from a bias incident, and we're crossing that threshold on the pyramid of prejudice to the bias crime statute. You cannot have a bias crime unless you have an underlying crime. So when I say that, there can be no bias crime unless a crime has been committed. And what I mean by a crime being committed, the crime of harassment, terroristic threat, simple assault, aggravated assault, arson, murder, any crime statute that fits into the category of the 2C-61 statute will apply to the bias intimidation statute. And what that says is that a bias crime, when police are investigating, they're looking to see if the person committed the crime, attempted to commit the crime, conspired with another to commit the crime, or threatened the immediate commission of the crime, and if that was motivated by one of the 9 protected classes. Next slide. And again, the 9 protected classes are race, color, religion, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, national origin, or ethnicity. So in a bias crime, when law enforcement is investigating to see if they have enough probable cause to sign a complaint for 2C16.1 bias intimidation or a bias crime, that law enforcement officer is looking at 3 basic motives. Number 1 is a crime been committed, an underlying offense. Number 2 is that underlying offense, that crime, was that crime motivated by one of the 9 protected classes? And was the victim intimidated by the actions of the perpetrator? Next slide. What does intimidate mean? What law enforcement is looking for, and as Detective Christensen stated, please let the law enforcement officer know everything that you know about what occurred. And what the law enforcement officer is looking for is whether or not what happened to the victim caused the victim to be intimidated. What does intimidate mean? To make timid or fearful, to compel, deter, or is by threatening them, to frighten them into submission. Next. To induce fear or make a sense of inferior to one another, make somebody feel inferior to one another, implies a reduction where the spirit is broken or all courage is lost. And it implies an intimidating or overcoming the resistance of urging demands and threats. So intimidation is part of what law enforcement and the prosecutor has to prove in a courtroom in order to get a conviction for 2C16.1 bias intimidation. Next slide. It is so important that you, as the community, our stakeholders, if you see something, you say something. Whether it falls into the category of the bottom of the pyramid where it's just an incident, even though it's just an incident, that may be a message that something could happen in the future that rises to the level of a crime. It also gives law enforcement an idea of what's going on in our community, and prosecutors can use bias incident offense reports in moving forward to prove the motivation of a bias crime if a bias crime occurs. The New Jersey Bias Crime Officer Association is so proud to partner with you and all of our law enforcement stakeholders to make sure that our community is safe, to make sure that nobody's the victim of any type of bias. But if you are, overwhelmingly, you need to know that we're here with you, that we want to know. And please, if you see something, say something. On the screen right now is my direct point of contact, my direct office number within the Middlesex County Department of Corrections and Youth Services, my cell number, where you can reach out to me 24 hours a day, and my email address. I'd like to thank everybody who took the time out of their weekend, their Saturday, to listen to what I and our other presenters had to say today. And now I would like to thank Matt and open it up to questions and comments.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. Very valuable information you shared with us. And we're gonna actually open up Q&A at the end of our presentation. We have some questions that folks have asked prior to today's event. We'll also be opening up the chat so you can chat your questions for any of the presenters from this morning. We'll continue on with legal specialist Danielle Thorne, who is with the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, and she'll be talking about bias situations which are civil in nature.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here this morning. I am Danielle Thorne, and I work with the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. I am a legal specialist there, and I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk to you about what the Division on Civil Rights does to protect the community when discrimination and harassment occurs. Next slide. So the law against discrimination is our state's civil rights law, and it prohibits discrimination and harassment in 3 areas: employment, or 4 areas, employment, housing and real estate, places of public accommodation, and credit and contracting. Places of public accommodation include any place that is open to the public. So that's a school or a government building or public transportation, restaurants, theaters, hotels, doctors' offices, hospitals. If it is open to the public, it is something that the law against discrimination applies to. Next slide. The law against discrimination, or the LAD as we call it, prohibits discrimination and harassment on the basis of a number of protected categories. It prohibits discrimination and harassment on the basis of race, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, disability, pregnancy or breastfeeding, liability for service in the U.S. military, which means that if you work in the U.S. military, you cannot be discriminated against for that fact. And in some cases, it also provides protection for family status, marital status, or age. Next slide. Now, we've been talking a lot about reporting bias incidents and bias crimes today. And I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what the difference is between an investigation with the Division on Civil Rights, which is my office, and a criminal investigation. Criminal investigations focus on whether a crime occurred, whereas investigations by my office focus on whether a violation of the law against discrimination has occurred. So what's the difference there? It means that in the case of bias-based harassment, for example, criminal investigations are going to focus primarily on the individual perpetrator, the person who did the harassment, and whether or not that person committed and can be convicted of a crime. My office is going to look into whether the employer or housing provider or place of public accommodation, like a school, knew that someone committed that bias-based harassment and yet failed to take appropriate steps to stop it or address it. So if harassment happens at work, or if harassment happens in your housing complex, or if it happens in your child's school, and your employer or housing provider or the school knows about the harassment and doesn't intervene, my office can step in to make sure that they address it appropriately and take steps to make that harassment stop. And the important thing to understand about the difference between a criminal investigation and an investigation by the Division on Civil Rights is that my office can investigate discrimination and bias-based harassment even when the conduct involved doesn't rise to the level of a crime. Next slide. If someone files a complaint with our office, there are a number of remedies. There's what we call equitable relief, which means that we can require an employer or your child's school to conduct anti-bias training. We can require them to put in place new anti-discrimination or anti-harassment policies. We can require them to open themselves up to monitoring by our office. If you file a complaint and a violation of the law against discrimination is found, you also might be entitled to money damages, and there are also statutory penalties. Next slide. These are the contact numbers for our regional offices. You can call any one of those offices to file a complaint. There's also a statewide housing hotline, so if you face discrimination or harassment in the context of housing, you can call that number on the bottom. And then our website is on the bottom as well. I only have a few minutes to speak with you today, but we are in the process of putting together a longer presentation that focuses on the civil remedies available to folks who have experienced discrimination and harassment and bias incidents, as opposed to the criminal remedies. Today's presentation has been focused mostly on the criminal remedies. And so I encourage any of you who have questions about your child's rights in school, or your rights at your employer, or in your place of work, or your rights at a restaurant or in a government office, to join, to look for the information on the next presentation where we will address civil in more detail, and to join that later call to learn more. That said, in the meantime, if your child faces discrimination at school, or if you face discrimination in employment or in the place where you live, you should not hesitate to call one of the numbers on the screen and reach out to our office. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to working with you.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. Appreciate the information, and we do look forward to that follow-up session. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and move from state bias incidents and bias crimes to federal hate crimes. And we're going to have the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rahul Agarwal, share that information with us.
All right, Matt, thanks a lot, and thank you to Matt and Harpreet and the other organizers of this event, both for putting it together and for asking us to attend. To all of you out there in the audience, thanks for taking some time out on a Saturday morning to hear from us. The topic is one that's near and dear to my heart, and I think one that's close to the hearts of everyone on this panel. For me in particular, I'll just say, you know, as a first-generation Indian American, it actually means a whole lot to me personally just to be talking to you all for a few minutes today about federal hate crimes. And so, again, thanks for having us. What you see on the screen right now is just my name and my phone number and my email. And at the very end of this presentation, you'll see another set of phone numbers and I think another email. And I want to highlight those things because I'll say what a lot of folks have already told you today, which is just reach out and contact somebody if you see something that you know is wrong. It doesn't mean that we'll be able to bring a federal prosecution. It certainly doesn't mean that a crime has necessarily been committed. But what it does do is allow the folks on this panel to use their resources, and it allows us on the federal side to use our resources to investigate, to figure out what happened, and to see if there's something that we should be charging. So I sort of appreciate you guys having us on this panel, and I stress to you to please contact us if you have anything to report. With that, can I get the next slide? Okay, so I wanted to spend a few minutes taking you through what a federal hate crime is and then talking to you about some of our statutes. A federal hate crime is what it sounds like, a crime motivated by prejudice or bias based on a protected characteristic. And as you've heard from a number of people, there are a lot of different protected characteristics: race, color, religion, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability. Depending upon the federal statute at play, one or more of those protected characteristics apply. And so again, if one of those protected characteristics is at issue in a case, there are some federal statutes that we can use. Next slide, please. Okay, our main tool for prosecuting federal hate crimes is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. Many of you in the audience may recall the genesis of this act. Matthew Shepard was a homosexual who was attacked and murdered on account of his sexuality. James Byrd Jr. was an African American who was dragged through the streets of Texas and murdered on account of his race. At the time of these murders, there was no hate crimes prevention statute, or at least not a statute that covered as broad an amount of conduct as this one does. And so many years after those incidents, due to the work of a lot of folks who pressed for a better statute, this one was passed. It's Title 18, United States Code, Section 249. And you have on the screen the elements for that statute. If you willfully cause bodily injury to a person or attempt to do so through the use of fire, a firearm, a dangerous weapon, or an explosive, because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability, and if that crime affects interstate or foreign commerce, and that depends on certain instances, then this is a statute that we can use to prosecute that activity. And what I underline the words "because of." That's something that you'll see in every hate crime statute. That's the key here. If the individual who committed the crime acted because of one of those protected characteristics, that crime now falls within a hate crime statute. And so this statute 249 is one that we go to often when it comes to prosecuting these cases. Next slide, please. Now, what I wanted to do with this statute was give you two examples. My boss, you heard from him at the very beginning, Craig Carpenito, the U.S. Attorney for our district, who has made it, one of his sort of signature moves to prosecute, to investigate, to aggressively bring cases involving hate crimes and the violation of civil rights. And under his leadership, I think we've been able to do that. I wanted to give you two examples of us using that statute, 18 U.S.C. 249. The first example is the one on the left. And this is a few years old. It's from 2011, 2012. But it involved two members of different groups. One individual was a member of a group called the Aryan Terror Brigade, and another individual was a member of a group called the Atlantic City Skins. And what they decided one night on New Year's Eve to do was to gather at somebody's residence to listen to white supremacist music, and then to leave their residence and find people who were non-white to assault. They ultimately ended up assaulting a number of individuals of Egyptian origin. Those male victims suffered serious injuries, and we prosecuted them under this statute, and they received, substantial sentences. On the right side, what you see is the case that my boss was talking about. This is a case that's ongoing. There is a trial that is yet to be scheduled, but this is the chief of police in Bordentown, New Jersey. And it's the first police officer in at least 10 years to be charged with a federal hate crime. That, again, is a case that our office brought, and we are awaiting the chance to retry that case against that officer. Next slide, please. Okay. There are a number of other statutes, and I've taken you through the main one, which is 249, but I'll quickly go through a couple of others. The Fair Housing Act makes it a crime to use or threaten to use force to willfully injure, intimidate, or interfere with a victim because of the victim's race, color, religion, gender, handicap, familial status, or national origin. And in this case, that's because the victim was enjoying a housing right. So again, if you're being interfered with in your capacity as a tenant of a place, in your capacity as an individual who's looking to purchase a residence, in your capacity as someone who is enjoying another right associated with housing, and someone is interfering with you and threatening to use force because of your race, color, religion, gender, handicap, familial status, or national origin, this is a statute that applies, and it is a case that we could bring. Next slide, please. The next statute is 18 U.S.C. 247, and this involves damage to religious property. If you intentionally deface, damage, or destroy any religious real property because of the religious character of that property, and if the offense was in or affected interstate commerce, this again is a statute that we can use. Often this statute has been used to prosecute folks who have attempted to firebomb churches. But as many of you on this call are familiar with, religious institutions around the country have been threatened by a number of actors, and it doesn't have to be churches, right? And so this is, of course, a statute that is at play that we could use. Next slide, please. As an example, you may recall the massacre in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This statute, the one that I just referred to, was used to prosecute the assailant in that case. Next slide, please. Okay, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'll go quickly here. This is yet another statute that protects that is a federal hate crime statute. And the key here is the last bullet. Everything else is the same as what you've seen before, but in this case, the activity that the victim has to be engaged in is a protected activity, namely public education, employment, jury service, voting, travel, or the enjoyment of public accommodations.
Raul, you got 2 minutes.
Great, thanks. Okay, and then finally, there's another statute, conspiracy against rights. This is a civil rights statute. And the reason I bring this up is because although there are a number of hate crime statutes at play, we also have other statutes that we can use to prosecute people who commit crimes. And in this case, if two people conspire to intimidate, injure, threaten somebody in the free exercise or enjoyment of a right that that person has pursuant to the Constitution, we can bring a case. And so it doesn't have to be a hate crimes case in this instance. We don't have to show that the individual acted because of a protected characteristic, but we do have to show that somebody and somebody else conspired, that they agreed to threaten somebody and to violate that person's constitutional rights. My example here is US v. Richard Tobin, which is a case that we've brought against Mr. Tobin. Mr. Tobin was charged with causing people around the country to commit vandalism with respect to synagogues, and he was charged under this statute. Next slide, please. And then very quickly, I just highlight these two cases. We charged a narcotics and firearms case against an individual who had white supremacist propaganda, and we charged a statute that criminalizes conveying a bomb threat to a religious institution against James Triano, who recently pled guilty. I highlight these cases and the last case because I want to make the point very clearly that although federal hate crimes are what those statutes are important to us, we take this very seriously, and our goal here is to bring criminal charges wherever we can. So, if a federal hate crime statute does not apply, but we do have a narcotics or a firearms or another statute that we can use, we'll do it. Because again, our tack here is to be as aggressive as we can to deter and root out hate-filled violence. Next slide, please. Finally, what you'll see in a typical hate crime case from us is that we receive referrals from you and from local law enforcement partners. We partner with a lot of the folks on this panel and a lot of our local partners around the state, including the Attorney General's office. And we work hand in hand with those folks where we can to bring either state or federal charges. Next slide, please. And this is the slide I promised you, and I would say it's the most important because it gives you the contact information for how to let us know what you're seeing. If you see something, say something. If you want to call it or if you want to report it to your local police, do so. But if you want to report it to us, we're happy to do that intake. On that screen is your civil rights complaint hotline. There's also an FBI tip line. And I just encourage you to report on what you see so that we can go out and do our jobs. And again, I thank you all for attending the panel, and I thank our panelists for having us here. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much, Raul. We're going to open up the chat lines, and we're also going to read some questions that were sent to us prior to today's event. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Harpreet Singh Mocha, to facilitate the Q&A session.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We've had over 900 people join us, and we're thrilled about that. Matt, don't go too far. We'll need your help. We've received a lot of your questions via chat, and we also received some questions, a lot of questions prior to the while registering from the audience members. So we're just going to start and jump in for the first 2-3 questions. We're going to just jump in and direct them towards Daniel Thorne from the Division of Civil Rights. And Daniel, the question goes that a neighbor, my Japanese American family was an intern during World War II. Just a few months ago, fellow New Jersey residents told me that this was a good thing to, quote, prevent sabotage, unquote, period. While not a bias incident, it means that education is still needed to deal with prejudice. Racism starts early in the world. How can we work with children and ask parents to cooperate and to promote education about discrimination in school arenas?
First, I want to say unequivocally, I am so sorry that a fellow resident said something so hurtful and so wrong. You are absolutely right that education is critical. And the director of my division, the Division on Civil Rights, is currently leading a task force right now that is looking into what the state can better do to address bias and discrimination among young people and in our schools. Many people have raised through that process with us the need for education in our schools at a very young age to address bias. We have heard that at listening session after listening session. And I want you to know that we hear you and that the task force will be issuing a report later this year with concrete recommendations that get just exactly at how we address bias through education and how we partner with our schools and our parents and our communities to accomplish that.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is, what are the different ways to report a hate crime? Is 911 the only way? Can people do it online and only to your local police? Detective Christensen, maybe you can take a stab at that first.
I think we have to give a chance for his video to come online.
Well, then I'll answer follow question. Okay, Brian's there. Good,
great. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, there's several ways to report a bias incident. We always try to ask to report it to your local police first. That's the agency that's going to be responsible for then documenting it with the bias incident. But for some reason you don't feel comfortable, every county prosecutor's office has a dedicated bias crime liaison within the county prosecutor's office. And it's either led by a detective or an assistant prosecutor. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always report to the Division of Criminal Justice. Everyone should have received all the literature on how to contact us. We have our email, our njbias@njbcj.org is a great way to contact us to assist you. Again, as the Assistant United States Attorney also said that if you don't feel comfortable going to any state agency, you could always report this to the FBI, who would be glad to assist you in this fashion as well.
Follow-up question from you from the chat. What is the latest one can report a bias incident, and what counts as a race bias?
So the latest someone can report a bias incident will differ based on the statute of limitations for all of the crimes that have happened. As the more severe crimes that go up, the longer statute of limitations to actually report these incidents. In general, it's better to report these things immediately when they happen. The police then have the ability then to actually investigate these crimes. They can go out, get surveillance footage. They can actually follow up with witnesses as well. As far as a race-based, race is one of the protected categories for the state of New Jersey. So, you know, that is a protected category for a bias incident.
Okay. Our next question we have is for you again, Detective Christensen. Can you provide ways to handle situations when you encounter verbal harassment or feel someone can cause physical harm?
I will always say this: call 911. Call 911. That's why the police are here for you. We're here to help you out. In cases of verbal harassment, I would suggest to stay away from the person if they are verbally harassing you based on you being Asian. If they're going to cause a physical attack, get away from that situation. Again, try to remember as much as what's going on in that. I know these situations are tough to remember, especially as these incidents are happening. And the police will never look down upon you if you can't remember, you know, what exactly the person looked like. But it is important to give as much detail as you can on these situations. But I will always say this: call 911 immediately when something like that happens.
And what if communities are facing COVID-19 discrimination? What do they do? How do they report? Is that any different, or is that the same?
It's the same for COVID-19. We've really, again, and as I stated before, we've taken a real close look into what's going on with this. We encourage everyone to report this, and we really took a long, hard look and feel that some of this stuff is being underreported currently. As anyone can have seen in the news recently, this past week in Wyckoff, a Chinese restaurant was targeted COVID-19 related. That was documented by the local police as a bias incident. It has now been reviewed by the county prosecutor's office and our office as well. So we suggest anything that's COVID-19 related, and if it's being targeted due to someone being Asian, report that. That's a bias incident.
All right, wonderful. So report. This is a question, Brian, stay on. Maybe also we can have Daniel Thorne come on. If the perpetrators are kids, say middle schoolers, should it be reported, and who should it be reported to? Who will be held responsible for the incidents committed by these minors, them or their parents? But how do we go about reporting discriminatory behavior, whether it be COVID-19 based or bullying behavior by middle schoolers?
So I'll handle the first part about this and pass it off to Danielle when it involves specifically in schools, the bias-based bullying. But if someone is to report a bias incident for a juvenile, they report it to the police. The police have options at that point to do a station house adjustment in being able to speak to the juvenile and kind of investigate what exactly is going on, what caused them to use whatever slur, or if they did something more violent possibly, to do their investigation. So police will handle that aspect of that. When it comes to schools, Danielle can comment on that.
Absolutely. So when it comes to harassment that your child might face at school, whether that be specifically targeting them because they are Asian, or targeting them with harassing comments around COVID-19 because they are Asian, you should report that a few different ways. Report it to your school, right? Report it to the principal. If it occurs in school or among students, even if it occurs among students off school grounds, you can report it to the school. You can also report it to our office. Under the law against discrimination, schools must take steps to address harassment of students by other students if the school knows about it, or if they should know about it. So if it's happening at school so regularly and happening in front of teachers that the school should know, they're responsible to intervene then too. That can be true, as I said, even if it doesn't happen on school grounds. So if your child's school is not addressing harassment by a fellow student, my office can and will address that, and you should report it to us.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that information. My next question is for David, Rob, and Raul. If someone says to me, get out of this country based on my race, but without any further action, should I report it? Is there any consequence on this person if I do report? And then the next follow-up question is, where is the line between protected speech and unprotected speech? So I'll, Rob, you want to take a stab at it, and then Raul, and then we'll go to David? Unmute your, we can't hear you, Rob.
So I was having some technical issues, so maybe start with Rahul and I'll catch up.
No, we can hear you now.
Okay. No, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, well, we'll start Raul and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
As I recall, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
As I recall the question, I think the first question was, if someone says get out of the country, is that something you should report? And I think the corollary is, is that actionable as a crime? So I think what I would say is it is something you should report. I don't think it is a federal crime. And I think those are that's the interplay. And the reason that I say you should report it, notwithstanding the fact that it may not be a federal crime, is because we want to know who said that. Because the individual who said that to you is saying to other people, there may be something that we need to look into. And I think the reason that I sort of stress, and I think the reason that everybody on this panel is stressing reporting, is not, again, because every case is going to result in a prosecution, but it's because we want to know who the folks are out there that are saying these things, so that if we see a lot of those people doing something, we can connect some dots. We can try to put things together. That may be a data point that's helpful in us bringing a case against that individual later on. So that's how I'd respond to the first one. And then your second one, I think, hits on something that always sort of befuddles us, right? Which is this line between protected speech and actionable crime, right? And that is something that we've been dealing with sort of throughout the prosecution of hate crimes cases. And I think I would say is this, right? Of course, there's protected speech, and the point at which we look to see whether it crosses the line is, when is there a threat communicated? How active is the threat? What is that person communicating an intent to do something, to use force, to harm in some way, to do something that is going to cause damage to you, property, based on a protected characteristic? And at that point, I think we can take action, or at least determine, right, whether there's something else that shows that the threat that the person was making, it wasn't a true threat. But again, if the person is simply saying to you something reprehensible, like "get out of my country," that is not a federal crime, but it is something that we'd want to know about. And I turn it over to Dave and Rob.
Thank you. And when it comes to protected speech versus potential criminal activity, we in New Jersey look at the harassment statute, maybe even the terroristic threat statute. Like I said, the difference between a bias incident and a bias crime. A bias incident is the bottom level of the pyramid, but it's real or perceived. So national origin is one of the protected classes within the bias incident definition and the bias crime statute. So if somebody's telling you to get out of our country or go back to your country, we can perceive that that's motivated by national origin or perceived national origin. Therefore, it would fit into the bias incident statute. And I would say that should definitely be reported. And if it happens in school by school-age children, I think it's important that everybody knows that most, if not all, superintendents of county school super districts have a memorandum of agreement with their local prosecutor's office and local law enforcement. So I would say report that incident to school when it happens as soon as possible. And then that school is obligated to make that contact with their local police department. A lot of schools have school resource officers. A lot of schools have Special 3 officers in the school. They'll make that initial contact right then and there, or they can call a local police and a response would be required. When it comes to the protected speech versus harassment or terroristic threat, my good friend and somebody who deals with this often, Director Sepio, could probably answer that question a little bit better than I can.
Thank you, and thank you for catching me up. Two things. Should you report? Absolutely, for all the reasons why people have indicated on the call. Dave Leonardis at the tail end is going to, I think, provide a story on the seminar as to why and how something was not reported and it ultimately led to violent acts. So it allows us in law enforcement and the law enforcement community, as expressed, to provide us intelligence, to see whether something is bubbling up, or to see if someone actually is on our radar, that we need to do further investigations and start doing what we do, where they may be saying this, but they also may be actually committing crimes as well, or plan on committing crimes that we can actually intercept. And so please report, leave it up to us to determine whether or not it falls under bias incident or bias crime in that process. With regard to protected speech and First Amendment, we have a number of statutes on the books that deal specifically with criminal offenses. For example, terroristic threats, for example, harassment as indicated, where there's an intent to commit a crime, to threaten, extortion. All of those are speech statements or threats that is not protected under the First Amendment. And so as a result of that, there are instances and times in which where a criminal intent is there and a defendant can be charged. Get out of my country shouldn't happen. This is our country. We are all in this together, and that is something that we would be interested in.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. We're going to go into, this is a question from the chat regarding numbers. Can you share more details about the bias incidences against Asians in 2020 in New Jersey? For instance, a breakdown into different Asian communities, type of incidences. Is that possible? I mean, and then two, are there increasing hate crimes against Asian Americans recently in New Jersey due to COVID-19? Maybe David Leonardis, Brian Christensen.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. As far as stats that we've had from the Asian community, I will say that as compared to New York City, which has seen a large dramatic increase of reported Asian bias incidents, we really aren't on that level, which is why this session is great. And, you know, a lot of you are coming out, and I've seen on the chat log with, you know, bias incidents that have happened that haven't been reported to police. So I do think they're a little misrepresented. So I think they are a little bit lower. As far as the COVID-19 related bias incidents, it's really split in New Jersey between Asians as being targeted and people that are Jewish that have been targeted due to COVID-19. I've already given you the numbers as to the COVID-19 related bias incidents, and I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I believe we had 14 of them that were Asian related. I have seen on the chat log that there has been other COVID-19 related bias incidents. I can't say this enough, and I know you're probably going to get sick of me saying this, but please report it. It's the only thing that we can actually do to kind of tackle this right now and actually to see the proper picture of what's going on in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, and to add to that, if I can, when Harpreet and Matt and I first sat down and began to discuss numbers, you know, of COVID-related bias incidents against Asians, we had 6 incidents against Asians in New Jersey, and at the time, Matt and Harpreet are telling us that there's nearly 1,000 nationwide. So, I mean, if you take a look at those numbers, you know, you like to think that it's not occurring in New Jersey, but we know from talking with our partners from the community, the Asian community, that that's not the case. They are occurring, and that people are afraid to come forward to report. So, you know, everybody else said, and I'll say it myself, you got to come forward. It's really important.
No, thank you. Really appreciate that. I can't stress enough that when we were talking, when we were discussing about this forum, we sat down with the Asian American Working Group that we had identified, and with their help and their input, we came up and we organized this hate crime forum. And I want to especially thank them and our panelists, everybody who's taken out their time on a beautiful Saturday. It's not raining here and the sun's out. And I really appreciate that. And everybody for attending, over 900 people. I really appreciate that. But I wanted to individually thank the U.S. Attorney, A.G. Garival. A big shout out to David Leonardis for all his hard work day and night, continuous emailing me and late nights about things. And all our speakers, Detective Brian Christensen, David D'Amico, Raul Argerval, Daniel Thorne. I really appreciate you all. A big shout out to Holly Lee for all her background help, Whitney Lewis, and Marie. Really appreciate you with all your help, and also to my colleague Matt Latimer for coordinating things. And with that, I'm going to hand out, we're wrapping up. We got about 2-3 minutes left, and I'm going to hand off the ball to Dave Leonardis and to Robert Sabibio. And I wanted to say thank you once again.
Thanks, Harpreet. And just so everybody knows, and I think Rob will mention this too, we can go beyond the 12:30 mark if need be. So we'll leave that up to everyone's discretion. I do want to say this, that in the work that we've done with the Asian community collectively, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the issues do deal with civil matters. So you heard from Danielle Thorne from the Division on Civil Rights. And for those of you that don't know it, the Division on Civil Rights is part of the Attorney General's office in New Jersey here. So we are planning, as Danielle mentioned, to put on another session, a follow-up session. We are able to focus on your questions, your concerns that deal with civil matters. And we'll do that in conjunction with our partners from the U.S. Attorney's Office as well. So we just wanted to give you a heads up on that. The other piece of it, because there are some great questions that you have. They're coming in as we speak to deal with schools and public accommodations and things along those lines. So with that in mind, today's session is being videotaped. Those questions are being recorded. We are going to share this with you. So today's session, this videotape session, will be on the Attorney General's website. They store it under YouTube. All of the Attorney General's sessions, community sessions, are stored on the website, so you can find them there. And the other thing that I'd like you to know is that some of our partners from the Chinese, Korean community have offered to translate today's session into those languages. If there's anybody out there that's willing to translate today's session into other languages, please reach out to me. You'll see my contact information at the end. But as I mentioned before, I will be sending you follow-up information to everybody that's participating in today's event. So we certainly appreciate that. In addition to that, I'd just like to say that one member of the Asian community asked if I would share this story with you about the importance of reporting. So several years ago, back in 2014, there was a lot of unrest in the Ukraine, as we all remember. And the Jewish community was trying to, exit the Ukraine, the Kiev, because of that unrest. There were rabbis from New Jersey who were trying to collect donations to get members of the Jewish community out of the Kiev. And as they were advertising, one rabbi from here in New Jersey received a call from an individual who identified himself as Fraser Glenn Miller, came up on caller ID as such, and began to ask the rabbi, why are you collecting, these donations? What is this all about? So when the rabbi explained it, the Miller then began to come out with a lot of horrific remarks against Jews, the rabbi, and kept it going. And it was, he said a lot of awful things. When the rabbi got off the phone, the other rabbis who were in the room asked him if he was going to call the police. And he said, no, we're used to this. We've lived with this our whole life. Plus, the police are busy. I don't want to bother them with this. It seems trivial. Well, unbeknownst, 2 weeks later, it was a Sunday morning. I remember it well. Fraser Glenn Miller went out to a Jewish community center outside of in a suburb of Kansas City, and he shot 3 innocent people at the Jewish community center that were coming to the center. It was a 16-year-old boy, his grandfather, and the mother of 3. Ironically, none of them were Jewish. But the point is that had the rabbi called the local police would have done a suspicious activity report. That's just, standard procedure. That report, once it's submitted, goes immediately to New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, and immediately from there, it goes to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. Fraser Glenn Miller was on everyone's radar. He had done time in federal prison for hate crimes. He was a known KKK member. He belonged to many white supremacy groups. Everyone knew who he was. Had that been reported, there was a 2-week period where I feel pretty confident that the FBI would have, out in Kansas City, would have went and visited Mr. Miller. So, I shared that story with some of our friends from the Asian community. They asked me to repeat that story to you today about how important it is to report. So, as I mentioned before, if you need anything from me, you have my contact information. You will be receiving more information from me, including the PowerPoints, the slides, some of the questions that have been asked. And I'd just like to thank you for your participation today. We still have well over 800 people that are online, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I also want to thank all our partners. You see on the screen the partners from the Asian community and the working group and from law enforcement that were instrumental in creating this program. We do everything collaboratively, both from a law enforcement perspective and with the community. And so if you want to get involved, you can also reach out to Dave Leonardis as well. And we have a very large tent. We would love to actually bring you on board and have you help with many of the outreach events that we're doing with the Division of Criminal Justice and the Office of the Attorney General. We started this, and we're going to end it the same way. I started this by asking you one basic thing. In order for us to do our job, whether it be at the municipal, the local, the state, the county, or the federal level, the ask of you is this: please report. Please help us help you. Live your life not in isolation, not in fear, but actually living the American dream that all of you want. I want to thank Harpreet and our federal partners. I want to thank Whitney for giving up her Saturday as well. As you see on the screen, here is contact information for the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice, both Dave Leonardis and Brian Christensen that we have with the Bureau. And with that, I hope you get some vitamin D. I hope you enjoy this beautiful Saturday, and we look forward to working with you in the future in future events.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And that comes to a conclusion of our program. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye now.